Welcome everyone who's listening in from the live Zoom meeting, as well to those who watch and listen in from YouTube. I want to use the next half hour and tell you a little bit about what is social network analysis, what can we use social network analysis for, and basically what do you need to actually, perform, conduct a decent social network on your own. Well, the first thing we need is a social network. So the question would be, what actually is a social network? And I would think that most of you usually have the idea that if I ask you, okay, tell me about a social network, that something like Facebook, Instagram, or stuff like this comes to mind. And that's actually the problem. And that's why I want to start with this image. Maybe one or two of you have actually watched this movie, The Social Network. When I first heard about this movie, I was actually a bit concerned whether this will turn out a relatively decent movie, and that the title of the movie is actually relatively wrongly selected. Why is this? Well, because I thought this movie is about Facebook. And yes, okay, this movie is about Facebook, but it's not so much about Facebook as a social media platform, but it's more about the people behind Facebook. The idea of Facebook to connect people, to transform social networks in a digital context. That's actually the big difference between social networks and social media. Social networks, research in social networks, already existed in the early 2000s or early 20th century. In the early 2000s, what we call social media came up on a broad scale. Well, if I say social network analysis came up in the early 20th century, makes sense to think that social network analysis, that's not only related to analyzing something which happens in a computer, which happens via the internet. That there's a bit more behind the analysis of social networks. When, well, the first publications came out around 1910, 1920. That's actually the reason, as soon as you have some kind of players, people, individuals, companies that are related in one way or another, then you automatically can assume this to be, well, if not a perfect social network, at least some kind of network which shares more or less the same structure as a social network. We term this social only then if there's actually something like human relations involved. But well, social networks, that's something which you have with all of your friends. And you have a different social network with all of the guys with whom you work together or with whom you study together. So the term social network can be interpreted relatively far, relatively wide. Then, well, if the term itself can be interpreted this widely, also social network analysis means that a really far range of network types can be analyzed with the same tool set. Not only Facebook, not only Instagram, not only TikTok, but whenever there's relations between different actors. So what I want to do is first give you some examples, tell you how we can work with networks in general, analyze networks, how we can perhaps assign different players in a social network specific roles, and thereby decide who's an important player, who may be not so important in a network. And then also talk about some of the applications in this context. And finally, for those of you who are interested, a little bit more on the literature, which is actually used in this presentation or cited in this presentation. Finally, conclude with a short offer. But let's start with an example. As I said, most people, they think about social networks, they think about social media. Well, social media, that's the first relatively well example to be analyzed in the context of social networks. What you see here, that's actually an example from a research paper I did with one of our students at the ISM, which had the first objective to take a set of Instagram influencers based on women's fashion and take a look how they are connected to each other. So each color in this network represents one type of nationality. Particular, the blue ones, that's US influences. The yellow ones, that's German influences. And our idea was, in the first part, to get an idea, are the Germans only together with other Germans? Do they only follow the ideas from other Germans? Do the US guys only follow other US guys? Or is there like an interconnection between the different country groups? And as you can see here, there's quite a lot of interconnection going on. So Instagram, social media, actually realized what is called in the literature like the death of distance, that it led to geographic distance became basically unimportant if you analyze networks in this context. And the next step, what we actually did with the same network, was taking a look who of those influences actually has the most important role to play in this network of other important influencers. So who's basically the influencer on top, who's, so to speak, the alpha influencer, and who's just, well, a relatively important other influencer. So he might have 100,000 influences, but as compared to the really big guys, who even the most important influencers all follow, he might be relatively unimportant himself. And we could see here that maybe you heard about the so-called 80-20 rule, like 80% relates to 20% of all the actors. The same thing goes here as well. 80% of all the top influencers are really unimportant. Only 20% are really important influencers. And here we're talking about the big guys. So even only 20% of the big guys in social media are really big guys. And then again, for this small group, we have the same thing. Of the big guys, only other 20% are the ones on the absolute top. So, well, okay, works for social media, but what other applications do we have? Maybe if you're a little bit interested on German or international TV series, you might come across Game of Thrones. Maybe you've seen the TV series, maybe you read the books. So there's actually a researcher in the US, or sorry, in UK, who had the idea after season 7 to do a prediction on who of the important players who were still alive by season 7 will survive season 8. And he did this analysis based on social networks. He took a look which of the different actors occurred together in scenes, and thereby linked all the different players to each other. Who had to do with whom? Who actually knows whom? And then when he had the network, he took a look, what is the relative importance of the different players? Here you can see those printed in larger letters are the more important, the more prominent people in this network, in the show. And his idea was, well, only someone will die who has not this much of a significant importance in the overall network. And well, if you're following this, I don't want to spoil the fun for you, but for most of the examples, this actually works out relatively well. I say for most of them because, well, if you notice, you see, it doesn't work for all of this, but it worked relatively well that he could do a relatively good prognosis of what might actually happen in this context, which characters will be developed farther onwards in the next season. So this is one way to go. But well, I guess not all of you want to study Game of Thrones professionally. So if you stay with TV series, you could do the same thing for a more German series as well. Whereas I'm bringing this here only for one specific reason, because whereas in the slide before, we actually only had relations with they meet each other. Here, you also have the different type of relations. So it could be that you have different networks overlapping each other all the time. So here we could actually study not only do they know each other, but are they friends? Are they related? Are they in love with each other? And this offers us a multidimensional perspective on this. But still, you would still stay with analyzing TV series. So if you go one step further, we could also turn to politics. If I would ask you who's the most politically active Twitter user, I guess all of you would come up with Mr. Trump. Well, following or somewhere between, but also following the election in 2016, some US researchers started trying to get an idea how well are the followerships of Mr. Trump, so the right part here, the yellow right part, connected to the typical Clinton supporters. And you see, well, in the middle, there are some people where this overlaps, but in general, you have a clearly distinct left part and a clearly distinct right part. And the people have relatively little to do with each other. So you can clearly define this guy, for sure, if he is selected in the very right part, will vote for Trump. This guy on the left will vote for Clinton. And well, this then, if you know something like this, could be used to target the people in the middle and try to convince them that your idea is actually the better one. This is actually what the, whole, let's call this conflict, the whole discussion about the analytical firm, which actually did something like this based on posts on Facebook, tried to do. They tried to find out, are you undecided? Which camp would you rather support? And then try to send you corresponding, let's call this information on the different candidates to maybe impact your decision at election day. Well, the same thing which could be done for the US could also be done for Germany. So here they also studied Twitter, and they tried to get an idea who retweets the ideas of whom. So in other words, how are the different members of parliament or the different party members following or retweeting ideas from other party members or from party members from other parties, which shows you as well how well connected different ideas are, how close the different parties with their ideas, with the topics they concern themselves with, are connected to each other. And well, what we can see here is what may be not so surprising for those of you who know the German parties in some detail, that, for example, the Green Party is relatively closely linked to the rather left-wing oriented parties like the Social Party or the Left-Wing Party. Also, not so surprising is the closely linked CDU with the FDP. So the more conservative, more, let's say, employer-oriented parties. In my opinion, at least, it's pretty interesting that there's at least some close links in the middle part, which shows that the left-wing party and a rather liberal party are not so far apart from each other as well. However, it also shows that the more right-wing oriented AfD is relatively cut off and also not so interested in integrating with all the other existing parties. So this tells us a lot about how different ideas are shared. Who's actually interested in what other parties, what other people are interested in? Well, politics, one field. Different other field is the field of economics. Here I can give you one example from my own research. This was just the idea of mapping inventor or knowledge flows. I can take a look from which country or which area in a country, which region, do people migrate and where do they migrate to? And then start talking about why are they doing this? And here, this is an example for Russia, where you can see, well, little surprising, most of the people come somewhere from farther off and they all migrate to Moscow because there the really important companies are situated. There's actually pretty little happening besides the move towards Moscow. So it's basically all agglomerating at one point with a small side point in St. Petersburg, but nothing else is actually happening there. If you would compare this to the typical image for Germany, you would see there would be way more different centers where the people move to. There would be moving between the different centers. It's not like you go to one place and you stay at the place forever. Germany, that's way more dynamic. So this is one way to use this in economics. A different way, that's in tracking investment flows. Maybe you heard about the Chinese initiative, One Belt initiative of, well, taking up the idea of the Silk Road and now bring this into the 21st century. So they tried especially make it more interesting for the countries which are situated on either part of the Silk Road, being at the Silk Road via water or the Silk Road via land. And well, for this, a lot of investments have to take place. So a group of 2 Chinese researchers actually tried to map which country started investing in which other country. And the interesting thing to see here, well, this is a Chinese investment, a Chinese-driven investment, which, however, is also interesting for other involved countries, meaning that other countries besides China started investing in some countries which might be relatively far off. So you see, for example, a link between Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, and Mongolia. So here investments are flowing from the south to the north because they might be interested in getting closer relations to Mongolia and thereby integrating the whole of, let's call this, Eastern Asia a bit better, because this would also be beneficial for them. On the other part, yeah, there's a lot of integration in Europe happening because as well, a Western European country might be relatively interested in having a well-developed infrastructure in Eastern Europe so that the products could easily reach their country, because when they come from China via land, you have to cross through Eastern Europe. Same thing goes for Russia. In any way, at least if you go via land, you have to cross through Russia. So Russia is also interested in this because for them, again, also the idea of perhaps transporting some of the goods themselves using already existing infrastructure, fostering better relations, thereby more trade with the neighboring countries, might also be an interesting, well, opportunity. So investment flows is a different alternative from an economic perspective. But the question would be, okay, I gave you a lot of examples. How can you actually study this? So the first idea would be, how can we represent something like this in a way that can be studied? So in other words, how can we write a network mathematically? For this, let's just assume we have a network like this. Then we have different nodes. That's here the different points, like the P10, P7, P8, P3, and so forth. And we have edges connecting the different nodes. And in this case, the most easiest way to represent a network is by just saying I have a matrix, and the matrix has one column and row for each node. And if there is a connection between any two nodes, the corresponding entry of the matrix is 1. If there's no link between two nodes, the corresponding entry is 0. So if I take a look between 7 and 6, I can go into the field, which is, for example, in column 7, row 6. There's a relationship here, so I just mark this with a 1. So again, that's node, that's an edge. And if I want to represent this, I would have a matrix like this. This is actually the example for the first example I showed you on social media, on Instagram. That's a list of all the influencers we had. We have the same influencers as rows. We have the same influencers as columns. And if one influencer follows another, we get a 1. So here, for example, this influencer in F follows the influencer in row 5. So we have a 1 here. However, she does not follow the influencer in row 3. So that's why here we have a 0. That's an easy way to represent this. The advantage is, once I can represent this as a matrix, I can use all the stuff, all the mathematics one might perhaps already know from matrices. However, before we get there, one other alternative, how to write this down. This part was based on nodes. However, I can also build a list which lists all possible relations. So I just go, okay, there's a relation between those two. So I write down this edge. There's a relationship between those two. I write down this type of edge. And then I can write down how I call the different edges, and perhaps also if I give them a 1 or a different other weight. Because, well, here I said if one follows another, I give them just a 1. If they don't follow, I give them a 0. But I could also differentiate. I give them a 1 if they just follow. I give them a 2 if they also like their pictures. I give them a 3 if they also comment on their pictures. So I can differentiate which type of relations exist between those people. And well, once I have this, once I can start analyzing this, I can first say which type of measures, which type of statistics I have. The easiest way to go is the so-called degree or degree centrality. That's just, for example, on Instagram, how often do you follow someone? How often are you followed by other people? That's a degree or in degree and out degree. That's still relatively easy. You could also go with betweenness. How important is this particular actor in transmitting information? Or closeness, which is the best connected actor? This is basically the guy who knows everyone else. Or the eigenvalue centrality. Not only is this guy relatively well connected, but he's also connected to the really important guys. So the guy with a high closeness just knows a lot of people. The guy with a high eigenvalue centrality knows a lot of important people, knows the right people. That's actually what we used in our study on Instagram influencers and saying who's actually an alpha influencer. The alpha influencer, the one on top, That's the one with the highest eigenvalue centrality in this network. And well, eigenvalue centrality is somewhat related to something called authority scores, and betweenness is related to something called hub scores. So hub, you transfer information. You might not be so important, but you're important in transferring information. So you link different people together. Authority, you're actually linked with a lot of important people. Also something which a lot of you have used, well, at least if you've used Google at one point or another, that's the so-called PageRank. That's like a slightly different version of eigenvalue centrality. And that's how Google decides which page is actually number 1, which is page number 2, which is page number 3 of what you're showing. Well, besides those guys who have paid for the ads. But PageRank, that's also due to the name, is an idea of ranking different pages. Well, it's called PageRank, not because it links the importance of pages or ranks the importance of pages. It's due to Larry Page, one of the founders of Google, who actually published this in some paper in the 90s. Then we have the density, which just tells us how closely linked is the network as a general aspect. Are people relatively closely linked to each other? For example, in your cycle of friends, everyone knows each other. So that's a very dense network. In your university, for example, not everyone knows everyone else. So that's a less dense network. In the city you live, well, at least if you're not living in a small village with only like 20 people, it's also relatively sparsely that you know anyone, yet you have any kind of relation. So it's a very undense network. So density also tells us about what can we expect from the whole network. If we have a very dense network, well, it's relatively easy to find a way, for example, from one actor to another. If we have a very undense network, it's relatively problematic to find a relation between any two people in a network. And well, if we talk about density, we can pick up the idea of your circle of friends and introduce the term of a clique. A clique is a perfectly connected partial or sub-network. Everyone knows everyone else. So if we go back to my earlier example, and I will just skip the first part, we can use, based on those statistics, different roles as well. I already had to comment on hub, high degree centrality, so he's important, he links a lot of people. Also, like a broker, links a lot of people, but brokers not necessarily are linked to a lot of important people. Hubs, they're a bit more linked to important or more important people. On the other hand, local champions, they have a lot of connections. They play an important role in their direct network and they know the right people. Whereas hidden champions, they are similar, but in addition to the local champions, they're not only linking important people, they don't only know important people, but they're bringing whole groups together. So they're, for example, important in having different companies cooperate with each other. And now I'm basically here with the graphical representation of my network I had before. And I can take a look, where can I find those specific roles again? So this guy, for example, he links the click on the upper left with all the parts here on the right. That's why he's a hub. He has an important role of linking this click to the rest of the network. This guy is a broker because without him, no information could get from P6 to P2. This guy is a broker. He links the upper part, the lower part, and the right part of the networks to each other. But due to the fact that he's crucial for the network, because it would basically break apart without him, he's also to be considered a hidden champion. So it's not that if someone is a broker, he cannot be anything else. It's just an assignment for us to better understand which role does someone play in this network. Well, as I said, perfectly connected parts, so everyone knows everyone else. That's what we call a clique. So basically this guy here, so important, the P6 is so important because he links two cliques and connects the two cliques with the parts on the right, which are elsewise not part of the network at all. Well, if you now try to find out who's actually the important person, who's the important company in a sector, that's what you're going to look for. Who actually, for example, plays the role of a hidden champion? Who do I need to observe in most details? Because without him, all the cooperation networks wouldn't work anymore. Who's the one who brings the important players to the table? That's actually how we can find this out. This works for research, this works for cooperation, this works for social media in the same way. So here there's a different example also from our study on social media. This was basically trying to combine importance, as in eigenvalue centrality, with betweenness or reach, and take a look, who are the people on the right part, on the more left part, on the absolutely lower part. And believe it or not, this small box on the lower left, that's 80% of all our influences. So they're really unimportant. Whereas those guys, that's the absolute elite of influencing, so to speak. Well, this was more or less an idea on what you can do, how you can use this. In general, however, it applies that wherever you have a network, any type of network, you can apply network analytics, which even goes way beyond what I just proposed to you in this small presentation, because maybe you heard about data analytics. Data analytics allows you to build even more sophisticated networks, run even more sophisticated analyses on these networks. You can perhaps also ask, why is a network developing the way it is? You could ask the question, is there like an upper bound to the number of, for example, followers in Instagram, in social media? That's all questions that relate in one way or another to networks. So here, if you're just interested, some of the sources which were used in preparing this presentation. And, well, thank you for your attention. If you want to see more or have some additional questions, for those of you who listened in from YouTube, you can either reach me with the email from the introductory slide, or you can connect via academia.org, ResearchGate, or LinkedIn. For all the other guys who still stay with us, just wait a moment. For all of the guys from YouTube, thanks having you here. Have a nice day.